The Bible opens without a warm-up. No pantheon slugfest, no cosmic accident. A single sovereign voice fractures the dark, and everything that matters starts to take its place. Light separates from night. Waters stack up below and above. Dry land rises. Plants bloom. Seasons lock into rhythm. The narrative moves with the cadence of a craftsman who knows where each piece belongs. 6 days, each framed by evening and morning, with the seventh day resting like a crown on top. The Hebrew draws attention to order over spectacle, to purpose over fireworks. In a world saturated with myths of battling gods, Genesis coolly asserts that there is only one, and he does not struggle. Then comes a surprise. Humanity enters the scene not as an afterthought, but as the image-bearer, male and female, stamped with divine likeness, given dominion that looks like stewardship rather than domination. This is a world where work is good, where the ground offers strength rather than resistance, where the sky was made to be measured and admired. The text speaks of a garden planted in Eden, with rivers branching into names that echo through ancient maps: Dishon, Gihon, Tigris, Euphrates. A tree of life stands within reach. Another tree stands as a boundary, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Freedom hums here, not as an illusion, but as a dangerous gift. The narrative narrows like a camera zoom. A man formed from dust, a breath from God animating that dust into a living soul. A woman built from the man, matched to him with a unity that explains both intimacy and difference. Naked and unashamed. That phrase sticks because it already hints at the cost of what comes next. The serpent slides into the story with chilling economy. No origin story here, only cunning. A presence that distorts what God has said, that incites desire to seize rather than receive. The woman sees that the fruit is good for food, a delight to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. Humanity reaches. The boundary collapses. Innocence splinters. The ground itself groans. Shame enters like a storm front, and fig leaves become the first technology, fragile and unsuccessful. God calls not because he cannot find, but because he refuses to abandon. Consequences fall in precise patterns. Work becomes toil. Childbearing adds pain to joy. The serpent meets a prophecy of its ultimate defeat. The first death in Scripture is not a murder, but a covering. Animals slain to clothe the exposed, then eviction. A flaming sword guards the way back to the tree of life. Desire for self-rule costs access to eternal light. The arc of the entire Bible begins coiling right here. A family forms in the shadow of exile. Cain works the ground. Abel tends flocks. Offerings are brought, and the narrative lingers on the posture, not the produce. One offering is regarded, the other is not. Resentment swells into violence. The ground, once generous, drinks blood and becomes a witness against the killer. God exposes the crime and marks Cain, not for vengeance, but for limitation. The first city rises, named after a son, Enoch, erecting permanence where wandering had been ordained. Civilization accelerates. Music, metallurgy, husbandry. A man named Lamech boasts of killing, stacking violence on top of pride. The human story dashes forward with brilliance in one hand and brutality in the other. A counter-story runs beneath. Another son is born to Adam and Eve, named Seth. People begin to call on the name of the Lord. Genealogy takes center stage, not as filler, but as architecture. Names march across centuries with lifespans that stretch the modern mind. Adam 930, Seth 912, Methuselah 969. The numbers sound foreign, and yet the text uses them with matter-of-fact rhythm. Then a name breaks the pattern. Enoch lives 365 years, walks with God, and does not die. He is taken in the middle of a death-laden litany. One life sidesteps the grave. The genealogy points toward hope without explaining it. Genesis 6 turns the world upside down with 5 dense verses. The sons of God notice, the daughters of men, unions, form, giants roam. The Nephilim stride across the narrative like shadows cast from elsewhere. Interpretations swirl. Ancient Jewish traditions imagine angelic rebellion. Others hear whispers of tyrant kings claiming divine right. The text focuses less on sensationalism and more on consequence. Violence fills the earth. Corruption spreads like mold in a sealed house. Every intention of human hearts bends toward evil all the time. The ache of divine grief becomes explicit. This is not distant deism. This is a creator who feels, judges, and still seeks a way to redeem. Noah finds favor. The word leaps from the page like a lifeline. He is righteous, blameless, among his generation, a man who walks with God. The instruction arrives with precise detail. Build an ark, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, lower, middle, and upper decks. Gopher wood, pitch inside and out, a window, a door on the side. The vision is not fanciful. It is engineering at scale. Animals arrive by divine direction. Pairs of all kinds, with 7 pairs for the clean animals and birds. Food is stored. A family of 8 climbs into a vessel that looks like a wooden world. The fountains of the great deep burst. The windows of heaven open. Rain falls 40 days and nights, but the waters swell for 150 days. Mountains disappear. The ark rides a planet reset to watery chaos. Ancient tablets from Mesopotamia tell of a flood and an ark and a survivor named Utnapishtim. The echoes are real. The differences matter. In Genesis, the flood is not capricious annoyance, but moral judgment. The hero is not a trickster, but a man of obedience. The deity does not bicker with other gods. He covenants with the remnant. The waters recede. The ark grounds on the mountains of Ararat. A raven goes out, then a dove again, then a leaf. Dry land returns. The family steps out into proleptic Eden. An altar rises. A promise descends. Never again will all flesh be cut off by floodwaters. A rainbow stretches across sky like a bent bow hung up after battle. The sign is for God to see, and for humanity to remember. Fruitfulness is recommissioned. The value of life is underlined. Blood becomes sacred. Human lifespans shorten across the post-flood genealogy, step by step, as if the world itself now knows limits it once did not. Noah plants a vineyard and drinks. Storytellers in the ancient world often show their heroes with cracks. Ham sees his father's shame. Shem and Japheth cover their father without looking. A curse falls on Canaan, the son of Ham, and a blessing lands on Shem and Japheth. The table of nations in Genesis 10 spreads out 70 peoples across the ancient Near Eastern map. Mizraim connects to Egypt. Javan echoes across the seas. Cush, Put, Elam, Ashur, Aram. Nimrod stands out as a mighty hunter and founder of key cities, including Babel, Nineveh, and Kala. Civilization hums with ambition. Humanity wants to build up and reach higher. Then a plane in Shinar stages the next collision. One language knits humanity together. Bricks replace stone. Bitumen replaces mortar. The people say they will build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and make a name for themselves lest they be scattered over the face of the earth. The irony is surgical. They fear scattering, so they concentrate power. God comes down to see. The confusion of languages fractures the singular voice of the world into polyphony. Work stalls. The city halts. The people scatter not by choice, but by decree. Babel becomes the symbol of human pride interrupted, and a warning about centralized defiance. It also becomes the backdrop for one of the most daring promises in the Bible. A genealogy drops like a rope ladder from Shem to Abram. Modern readers race past names. The biblical author refuses to. Each father and son forms a hin. Terah takes his family from Ur of the Chaldeans to Haran. Ur, a gleaming city with ziggurats and scribes and trade networks, appears in archaeological records with all the weight of a real place. Abram is 75 when the call comes. Leave your country, your kin, your father's household. Go to a land to be shown. A sevenfold promise radiates outward. A great nation, a great name, blessing for him, blessing through him for all families of the earth. Not conquest, not empire, but a family as the vector of healing. Abram goes. Sarai goes. Lot goes. Altars rise at Shechem. Then between Bethel and Ai, a famine tests resolve, and Egypt pulls Abram down into the Nile's abundance. Fear unsettles him. Sarai is identified as his sister and taken into Pharaoh's house. Plagues stop a disaster. Pharaoh sends Abram away with wealth. Back in Canaan, their flocks multiply and tension with Lot surfaces. Abram yields the better land. Lot chooses the well-watered Jordan Valley, near Sodom. The narrative marks the city's reputation as wicked and great in sin. A war breaks out. 4 eastern kings, Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, Chedorlaomer of Elam, and Tidal of Goyim crush. 5 kings of the plain. Lot is taken captive. Abram mobilizes 318 trained men born in his household, pursues the coalition, divides forces by night, and recovers everything. A mysterious king-priest meets him, Melchizedek of Salem. He brings bread and wine, blesses Abram in the name of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Abram responds with 1/10 of the spoils. The king of Sodom offers the rest. Abram refuses, lest the king claim credit for Abram's wealth. The scene bristles with moral clarity against the backdrop of power politics. That night, a covenant ritual unfolds with eerie precision. Animals are cut in two. Abram falls into a deep, dreadful darkness. A prophecy unfolds of his offspring as aliens in a land not their own for 400 years, enslaved and oppressed, then delivered with great possessions. The land is marked from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. A smoking firepot and a flaming torch pass between the pieces. In the ancient world, passing between severed animals was how kings swore, basically saying that their fate would be like these animals if they break covenant. Here God alone passes through. The burden falls on him. Time presses on the promise. Sarai remains barren. She offers Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant, to Abram. Hagar conceives, and tension explodes. She flees into the wilderness. An angel of the Lord meets her by a spring on the way to Shur, names her son Ishmael, and speaks of him as a wild donkey of a man, living over against all his brothers. Hagar returns and gives birth. 13 years pass. Abram is 99. God appears as El Shaddai, commands blameless walking, renames Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, and seals the covenant with circumcision as an eternal sign. Laughter begins to crackle through the narrative. Isaac means he laughs. The promise begins to feel bodily, not abstract. 3 visitors arrive by the oaks of Mamre. Abraham hastens. Hospitality spills across the scene like a feast, and Sarah overhears the announcement that within a year she will bear a son. She laughs in the tent. The narrative carries that laughter forward into future chapters as a reminder that the covenant thrives on impossible beginnings. Then judgment comes into frame again. The outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah has grown great, and their sin very heavy. Abraham stands before the Lord. He appeals to divine justice and mercy held together. Numbers decline in his mouth from 50 to 10. The city never reaches the threshold. 2 angels enter Sodom at evening. The city seethes with violence, even as Lot presses urgent hospitality. The angels pull him in, blind the mob, and urge flight. Lot hesitates. The angels pull him, his wife, and his daughters out. The plain burns. Smoke rises like a furnace. Lot's wife turns back and becomes a pillar of salt, a tragic monument to divided allegiance. Lot's daughters, fearing extinction, commit a grim act to preserve lineage. Moab and Ammon are born. The Bible neither sanitizes nor celebrates. It records and warns. At last, the child arrives. Abraham is 100. Sarah is 90. Laughter becomes a name, and the joy is laced with the pain of separation. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away at Sarah's insistence. God hears the boy's cry, provides water, and promises to make him a nation. Both lines will grow. Only one line carries the covenant of blessing to the nations. Then the blade lifts over Moriah. Abraham rises early and journeys to a mountain that will become Jerusalem's future heartbeat. The instruction is clear and unbearable. Offer Isaac. The narrative maintains an icy minimalism, refusing to offer emotional commentary. Abraham binds the son of laughter. A ram appears, caught by its horns. Abraham names the place, a name that affirms provision in the nick of time. The angelic voice declares blessing multiplied, offspring as numerous as stars and sand, and nations blessed through this obedience. The story does not erase the horror. It transforms it into a pattern that will reverberate into the New Testament, where a father does not spare his son. In Genesis, substitution is born, and the knife falls on a ram. Sarah dies at 127 in Hebron. Abraham secures a burial plot at Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite, insisting on paying full price. The cave becomes the family tomb, a down payment on a land not yet possessed. Abraham sends a servant back to his kin to find a wife for Isaac. A well, a request for water, and a woman named Rebekah who runs. Hospitality reveals character. The servant bows, and Isaac welcomes Rebekah with comfort after his mother's death. The covenant line continues, even as Abraham's own story closes with sons by Keturah and a final burial alongside Sarah. Isaac's chapters move quietly but strategically. Ammon strikes again. God prohibits Egypt this time and reaffirms the promise. Abimelech, a Philistine king with a dynastic name, features in a treaty narrative. Wells matter. Water means life, and Isaac reopens wells his father dug, renaming them as a way of holding memory. Enmity with Philistine herders softens into treaty, a reminder that blessing on God's people can bleed into regional peace. Rebekah conceives after years of barrenness. Twins struggle within her. God reveals that two nations are in her womb, that the older will serve the younger. Esau emerges first, ruddy and hairy, a skilled hunter. Jacob follows, hand on heel, embodied ambition. One day, Jacob negotiates Esau's birthright for a bowl of red stew. The text stings with its simplicity. The birthright is treated lightly. A pattern sets in. Jacob learns schemes not because he mistrusts God, but because he trusts his own timing. Isaac grows old, and his sight dims. Rebekah moves with maternal cunning to secure the blessing announced before birth. Jacob becomes a goat hair impersonation. The deceit works, and Esau arrives too late to derail the pronouncement. Anger blazes. Jacob flees north toward Haran to find refuge with Laban, Rebekah's brother. On the run, Jacob sleeps on a stone near Luz. A dream cracks the night open. A stairway or ramp connects earth and heaven. Angels ascend and descend. God stands above or beside. The promise to Abraham and Isaac now passes to Jacob with fresh emphasis. Land, offspring like dust, the spread toward west-east, north and south, and the earth blessed through this family. Presence is guaranteed. Jacob wakes with awe and fear. He names the place Bethel, house of God, and vows devotion, describing the stone as a pillar and anticipating the promise of provision and return. The trickster meets the God who underwrites each step. Haran greets Jacob with romance and grindstone. A well reveals Rachel, Laban's daughter, and Jacob throws himself into labor for her hand. 7 years pass like days to him, and then the wedding night arrives. Mourning unveils Leah. Custom, deception, and irony collide. The deceiver is deceived. Another 7 years of service secure Rachel too. 12 sons begin to arrive, their births heavy with meaning. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, and Naphtali via Bilhah, Gad and Asher via Zilpah, Issachar, Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah, through Leah. At last Joseph arrives through Rachel, and later, Benjamin. Household economics good enough to bother Laban take shape. Jacob proposes terms that sound foolish to anyone watching the flocks. Spotted and speckled animals will be Jacob's wages. God visits Jacob in a dream and peels back the curtain on how the breeding plays out. Jacob leverages technique, and God's providence tilts the outcome. Laban's sons grumble that Jacob has taken their father's wealth. God tells Jacob to return home. Rachel and Leah agree, tired of being commodities. They leave secretly, teraphim missing from Laban's house. A tense chase ends in a covenant heap called Galid, or Mizpah, boundary stones on a relationship that nearly ended in violence. Jacob approaches Canaan with caution. Esau rides to meet him with 400 men. Jacob divides his camp, sends gifts in waves to soften the encounter, and prays honestly, reminding God of his promises once more. Night falls near the ford of Jabbok. Jacob ends up alone, and then he is not. A man wrestles him until daybreak. The mystery blazes here, and the text refuses to resolve it cleanly. The man touches Jacob's hip and dislocates it with a finger. Jacob refuses to let go without a blessing. A new name erupts. No longer Jacob, but Israel, for he has striven with God and with men, and prevailed. Jacob limps into sunrise, changed in mark. He names the place Peniel, for he has seen God face to face and survived. Identity shifts here from schemer to struggler, from grabbing heels to clinging to God. Esau's arrival, for all its dread, ends in embrace. Reconciliation materializes without erasing history. Jacob declines Esau's invitation to Seir and moves to Succoth, then to Shechem. There the story turns dark. Dinah is violated by Shechem, son of Hamor. He speaks of love and seeks marriage. Jacob's sons answer deceitfully, demanding circumcision for the city's men. On the third day, when pain is sharpest, Simeon and Levi slaughter the city and rescue their sister. Jacob recoils, fearing the backlash from surrounding Canaanites. God speaks, and Jacob returns to Bethel. The household purges foreign gods and jewelry, buries them under a terebinth, and moves under divine dread that keeps enemies away. Jacob builds an altar. Faith gets reset. Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, dies and is buried under an oak named Allon Bacuth, the oak of weeping. Rachel goes into hard labor near Ephrath and dies giving birth to Benjamin. Her grave becomes a landmark. Isaac dies at 180, and Esau and Jacob bury him together. Esau's genealogy in Genesis 36 flows, associating him with Seir, Edomite chiefs, and a kingship before Israel has a king. The red stew, sold birthright, has long-term threads. The text anchors family drama inside geopolitical realities. The camera swivels to a 17-year-old. Joseph brings a bad report about his brothers to Jacob. An ornate tunic marks him as favored. Dreams drive the wedge deeper. Sheaves bow to his sheath. Sun, moon, and 11 stars bow. The family responds with jealousy and rebuke. But the dreams settle into memory. Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers near Shechem and then Dothan. A plot sharpens. The brothers plan to kill him and cast the body into a pit, claiming a wild beast did it. Reuben maneuvers to spare him, aiming to return him to Jacob. Joseph's robe is stripped. He is thrown into a dry pit. A caravan of Ishmaelites and Midianites passes by, trafficking spices, balm, and myrrh to Egypt. Judah suggests a profit instead of blood. Joseph is sold for 20 shekels of silver. The robe is dipped in goat blood. Jacob tears his garments and mourns inconsolably. He refuses comfort, declaring he will go down to Sheol mourning for his son. Genesis does not sanitize the line of promise. Judah's chapter unfolds like a scar and a promise rolled together. Tamar, wronged and sidelined, secures justice through a dangerous ruse. Judah recognizes his failure with words that will later foreshadow his transformation. Twins are born, Perez and Zerah, with a birth scene that bends pattern and points toward a monarchy yet to arise from Perez's line. The future is already buttered on a knife edge of grace and responsibility. In Egypt, the narrative keeps punching upward. Joseph lands in the house of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. The Lord is with Joseph, and everything he touches prospers. Authority cascades onto him. Then temptation takes aim. Potiphar's wife presses for betrayal. Joseph refuses, not only because of loyalty to his master, but because sin against God remains the central factor in his calculus. She grabs his garment. He runs. Accusation flips the script. Prison swallows him. Even there, favor follows. The chief cupbearer and the chief baker land in the same prison and dream disturbing dreams in a single night. Joseph interprets, 3 branches mean 3 days and restoration for the cupbearer. 3 baskets mean 3 days and execution for the baker. The sequence unfolds exactly. Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember him. 2 years pass in silence until a crisis brings memory roaring back. Pharaoh dreams. 7 fat cows graze by the Nile. Then 7 gaunt cows devour them. 7 plump ears of grain are swallowed by 7 thin scorched ears. Pharaoh's magicians and wise men fail to interpret. Joseph is summoned, shaved, and dressed. He clarifies immediately that interpretation belongs to God. 7 years of plenty, 7 of famine. A plan emerges for a centralized storage system. Pharaoh recognizes the Spirit of God in Joseph and elevates him to second in command at age 30, placing his signet ring on Joseph's hand, dressing him in fine linen and a gold chain around his neck. A new name is given, Zaphanath-Paneah. Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, becomes his wife. Manasseh and Ephraim are born during the years of plenty, their names telling Joseph's heart. God made him forget all his hardship. God made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. The plan works. Grain heaps like sand gather in storehouses. The famine arrives on schedule, spreading its teeth across Egypt and beyond. The world comes to buy bread from Egypt. The story that began with jealousy in a family now touches empires. Providence has a long reach, and it never wastes a wound. Back in Canaan, Jacob hears that there is grain in Egypt. He sends 10 sons, keeping Benjamin home. The brothers bow before the unrecognized Joseph. The dreams from Dothan stand up and breathe. Joseph speaks through an interpreter, accusing them of being spies. He binds Simeon and demands that they bring Benjamin down as proof of honesty. He secretly returns their silver into their sacks. Ear eats at them. They report to Jacob. Time and hunger force Jacob's hand. Judah steps forward with a guarantee for Benjamin. The second journey intensifies everything. The brothers are brought to Joseph's house. A steward assures them about the silver. Simeon is released. Benjamin stands before Joseph, and something breaks in him. He rushes into another room to weep, then composes himself. A meal is laid out with Egyptian protocol in place. Hebrews together, but separated from Egyptians. Seating follows birth order eerily. Benjamin receives portions 5 times larger. Joseph loads them with grain, hides his silver cup in Benjamin's sack, and lets them leave. A short chase ends in a staged crisis. The cup is found, and the brothers return, torn open. Judah delivers one of Scripture's most moving speeches. He takes responsibility. He recounts the father's love for the youngest son. He offers himself as a substitute. Joseph cannot contain himself. He sends the Egyptians out, weeps so loudly that the palace hears, and reveals himself to his brothers. The family terrors melt under a larger sovereignty. Joseph reframes the entire ordeal. They meant evil. God meant it for good, to preserve life. Pharaoh welcomes Joseph's family with favor. Wagons are sent. Jacob receives news that Joseph is alive. He sees the wagons and his spirit revives. He stops at Beersheba to offer sacrifices. God speaks visions in the night, telling Jacob not to fear going down to Egypt and promising to bring him up again. The tally of Jacob's household moving to Egypt numbers 70. Goshen becomes their enclave, fertile for flocks and strategically separate from Egyptian culture. Joseph navigates a complex economic landscape, exchanging grain for money, then for livestock, then for land, establishing a vertical of Pharaoh's authority and a survival plan for the people. Priests' lands remain exempt. Joseph's administrative wisdom in crisis cements his legacy beyond a family reunion. Jacob meets Pharaoh, a patriarch blessing a king. The contrast is staggering. Jacob calls his life a pilgrimage of 130 years, marked by fewer and more difficult days than his father's. Pharaoh honors and settles them in the best of the land. Years pass. Jacob's eyes dim, but his spiritual sight brightens. He summons Joseph and swears that he will not be buried in Egypt, but in the tomb of his fathers. Joseph agrees. Then Jacob brings his grandsons forward for blessing. He crosses his hands, intentionally placing his right hand on the younger Ephraim and his left on Manasseh. Joseph attempts to correct him. Jacob refuses, insisting on the prophetic inversion. The younger will become greater. This theme of reversal runs like rebar through Genesis. Jacob gathers his sons and speaks words that are part blessing, part prophecy, part sober assessment. Reuben, unstable as water, forfeits preeminence. Simeon and Levi, instruments of violence, are divided and scattered. Judah, not Joseph, receives the scepter imagery, a promise of kingship, and the hint that tribute will stream to him until a figure of rule arrives. Zebulun will dwell by the sea. Issachar becomes a strong donkey serving under a burden. Dan judges his people, biting like a snake. Gad is raided, but raids back. Asher's bread is rich. Naphtali is a released doe. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring, branches running over a wall, attacked but strengthened by the mighty one. Benjamin tears like a wolf. These ancient words form a lattice of future history. They orient tribes, hint at landscapes, sketch wars, and whisper of crowns. Jacob dies at 147. A national-scale mourning unfolds. Joseph follows Egyptian protocols for embalming with 40 days of process and 70 days of mourning, then carries his father's remains up to the cave of Machpelah, with a procession described like state funerals. Canaan watches as the promise, even in burial, reaches back to the land. The brothers cringe again after Jacob's burial, fearful that Joseph's kindness was only for their father's sake. Joseph reaffirms his posture. He acknowledges evil but refuses vengeance. He chooses forgiveness inside the geometry of providence. The narrative creates a portrait of maturity under pressure that still humbles historians and pastors alike. The book inches toward a close with quiet yet seismic lines. Joseph lives to 110. He sees Ephraim's children to the third generation. He reminds his brothers that God will surely visit them and bring them up out of this land to the land he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He makes them swear to carry his bones up when that happens. The coffin that holds Joseph at the end of Genesis becomes a prophetic anchor for the next book. The reader feels the growing weight of a nation inside a foreign empire. The promise stands, unresolved in the short term, unstoppable in the long. This narrative arc, from a garden with a boundary to a coffin in Egypt, moves with gravity. Some themes burn visibly, others glow in the embers. The image of God in humanity holds dignity even amid exile. The pattern of blessing through a family becomes the axis for history. God confronts violence and pride with judgment and mercy. Covenants mark the path like cairns on a mountain. trail signs you can measure with real materials, a rainbow, a circumcision, a new name, a plot of land, a ladder seen in a dream, a limp that never heals, a robe that turns into a prison uniform, and then into regalia. Nothing is wasted. Scholars draw lines between Genesis and the literature of its world, with both courage and caution. Blood stories litter Mesopotamian tablets, but Genesis outclasses them in moral clarity and covenant logic. Ancient law codes discuss theft and slavery, but Genesis places brothers and dreams at the center. Names like Haran, Hebron, and Goshen show up on maps and in excavations. The ages perplex and provoke. Some read them literally. Others see literary artistry beneath the numbers. The text refuses to flatten itself for academic control. It stays alive, layered, and fertile, and controversy never leaves the room. The serpent remains enigmatic. The Nephilim shimmer at the edges of comprehension. Babel preaches a sermon against technological pride without condemning technology itself. Circumcision functions both as identity and discipline. Sodom and Gomorrah warn against moral collapse, hospitality violations, and social injustice baked together into wickedness. Abraham on Moriah forces readers to confront the cost of trust in a covenant God who will later take into himself the very pain he once stayed. Jacob's wrestling with the divine admits that intimacy with God does not protect from pain. It often marks in a way you carry for life. Dreams organize the Joseph cycle, not as superstitious magic, but as another mode for the sovereign God to speak and steer in pagan courts. The genealogies structure time when everything else seems fluid. They place the promise in a lineage that never claims perfection. The line of promise is a corridor of flawed men and women held together by a God who binds himself to them with oaths and acts. The footholds feel secure because they never depend on human virtue alone. The narrative itself demonstrates the upside-down principle that will later start importuning fishermen and tax collectors. The elder serves the younger. The barren conceives. The dreamer enslaved becomes the deliverer. The deceiver becomes the one who clings to God. The life thrown into a pit rises to a throne, not to crush enemies, but to feed them and reconcile. Cultural markers in these chapters deserve attention. Altars by oaks signal sacred spaces in a land thick with ancient cults. Wells frame courtship because water binds the social economy. Famine serves as geopolitical tide, pulling patriarchs in and out of Egypt's orbit. Treaties with Philistine kings demonstrate that covenant life negotiates real politics, bride price, inheritance rights, the significance of firstborn status, and the lingering consequences of violence all show up with cultural specificity that anchors the narrative's theology in the grit of time and place. Even the price for a slave 20 shekels rings true to second millennium contexts, not as an anachronistic slip, but as the detail of a lived economy. The divine name appears with nuance. God reveals himself in creation as Elohim, then engages the patriarchs with increasingly intimate names and promises. El Shaddai underscores sustaining power. The Tetragrammaton, the personal name later revealed with fire in a bush, pulses in these stories as a promise deferred. Abraham calls on the name of the Lord by altars. Jacob hears the name at Bethel and Peniel, and his limp becomes a permanent liturgy. Joseph operates in Egypt as a bearer of divine wisdom, without jettisoning his Hebrew identity. The text unspools theology through history, not treatise through abstraction. The ethics burn clean and hard. Violence meets judgment. Injustice within the family meets exposure and renewal. Lies create debris. Truth brings risk. Hospitality saves. Pride scatters. Humility receives grace. The future opens through obedience, when disobedience seems more efficient. The patriarchs and matriarchs demonstrate both faith and failure, and they are judged and blessed accordingly. Curses fall on arrogant lines and abusive powers. Blessings fall wider than imagined circling even to Hagar and Ishmael, Lot and Moab, Edom and Egypt. Even the land carries a narrative role. Canaan appears not as a placeholder, but as a place with hills, oaks, streams, and caves that each carry memory. The cave at Machpelah testifies that graves can be acts of faith. Bethel announces that heaven and earth intersect in ordinary geography. Moriah foreshadows a city where sacrifices will telegraph deeper realities until a final one speaks a better word. Goshen becomes a greenhouse for a nation that will later feel the lash. Egypt will both save and enslave. That complexity fills the horizon as Genesis closes. The book's endgame moves quietly. Joseph's bones become a pledge. The covenant promise does not die with a patriarch. It waits inside a coffin for an exodus that is already written in the architecture of providence. Genesis teaches patience with promises that outlive individuals. It insists that the only way to understand history is to start with a garden, a word, a boundary, a breach, a covering, a flood, a bow of colors, a call, a covenant sealed under a sky of impossible stars, a laugh in a tent, a knife restrained, a night-long wrestle, a limp, a robe stripped and re-robed, a table laden with grain in a world of famine, and the good power of forgiveness, spoken in a palace and a pit. This is not a myth laid up high beyond reach. It is a story that travels by tent, vineyard, well, and caravan, that maps onto real hills and real markets, that tastes like dates and dust and tears. It is the seedbed for the rest of the Bible's plotline. It says that the world is not a cosmic orphan, that evil is not eternal, that judgment is real but mercy gets the last word, and that the God who speaks worlds into being also walks with families, names children, listens to slaves, counts stars with old men, and turns the world by dreams. And Genesis refuses to let the curtain fall with a neat bow. It leaves Joseph embalmed, placed in a coffin in Egypt, surrounded by pyramids that claim permanence. The text smuggles hope right into that scene. He said his bones would not stay. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will visit. He will break open waters again, not to judge this time, but to deliver. The covenant is alive. The promise is airborne. The family has become a nation. The name Israel now carries a limp and a legacy. And Egypt is not the final address. That unresolved tension has pulled readers into the next chapter for 3,000 years and counting.